If the Minnesota Timberwolves want to go through the Denver Nuggets, they're going to have to go through Nikola Jokic, and that means they're going to have to go through one of the best offensive engines in NBA history, who's leading one of the most efficient offenses ever. The Wolves aren't going to stop the 3-time and maybe soon to be 4-time MVP, and even slowing him down is going to be a tall task for any defense, but anything they can do to limit the effectiveness of Jokic and the way he orchestrates Denver's super potent offense will go a long way toward them getting an upset in this series. Again, to me, this isn't about shutting off Jokic. He's just going to do amazing things on a consistent basis. You can chase around shooters, have a hand in his face, send a late helper at him, force him to go away from the rim. Anything and everything that usually stops a player from being a scorer isn't really a foolproof method against him with his size and his IQ and his touch. So really, that's just going to be a built-in part of this series. Jokic is going to score a ton, and he's going to do a bunch of unholy things to Minnesota's defense, but that doesn't mean there aren't at least things Minnesota must do to dim some of the impact he's going to have, and more importantly, they can do to make sure he isn't just greasing the wheels of Denver's offense to a point where it genuinely becomes unstoppable. And I think first and foremost, Minnesota needs to be super alert and ready to switch off ball, and then do it over and over again with precision. Denver will feast on badly executed switches and rotations with their motion offense, which is obviously centered around Jokic, but contains a bunch of guys who want to move and cut and play off him perfectly. They're going to get the ball to Jokic in his spots, they're going to set these split screens, and if the two defenders involved in the action aren't on point, Jokic is going to pick the eyes out of the defense with his playmaking and his scoring. The constant movement is something Minnesota will really need to be sharp against in this series. There's going to be early drag screens for Jokic, and that's not a switch Minnesota wants with Edwards. But Denver are going to poke and prod at the defense with that off-ball movement until eventually they do get that switch, and if you get stuck in the wrong position on Jokic, it's game over. Now, this hasn't been a strength of Minnesota's this season. Guys like Anthony Edwards and Julius Randle are notoriously bad in switching situations, and guys like Naz Reid and Dante DiVincenzo are better, but still very susceptible to bad angles or a late decision. And if those things pile up in this series, I don't really think Minnesota stand a chance. And Denver is really good at making switching a very, very difficult job. I think this is a prime example of that. With Jokic's court vision and flowing parts around him, this simple back screen becomes a defense killer. Conley should drop back into a switch onto Strother, and he does, but that leaves a lane for Hardaway to cut into with Ant out of position on this forced switch. I'm not sure anyone really makes a killer mistake there, but it ends in an uncontested dunk anyway. That's the kind of stress that Jokic and the Denver offensive scheme around him puts on a defense, and the fact is that we're going to see that break Minnesota's defense a bunch in this series, no matter who ends up winning. The good thing though is that Minnesota has a ton of film against this free-flowing Nuggets offense, even in this season alone, and a lot of that is really good film that they can dig into and try to replicate. They're going to have to be really sharp though. When Denver's off-ball screens force that switch, again designed to get McDaniels on Johnson's back as he dives to the rim, there has to be backside help ready to make rotations and blow those actions up, and then fan back out and make scrambling rotations as well. That might not stop Jokic from getting a shot there in the end, but it cut off his first, second, and third options and forced him to make shots that he doesn't really want to shoot. Again, look at the activity here. McDaniels is going to have to spend time this series really hassling Jamal Murray full court. Then when he gets into that deadly pick and roll with Jokic, the switch needs to be perfect. Here we even see a scram switch from Edwards onto Murray, with Gobert flaring out to cover his man and run him off an open corner three, while Randall and McDaniels switch in the paint to get better matchups on Jokic, and even then you're still almost praying that Jokic misses a tough contested shot in the paint. That's the level of dedication it takes with rotations, switches, and help defense to limit this Denver offense. And to win 4 games against them, Minnesota is going to have to stack these possessions over and over again throughout multiple games. They're going to have to make Jokic work for his shots. They're going to have to maybe live with some shots from Denver's crew of elite role players. And they're going to have to be on high alert at all times. And best case scenario, they turn those stops into quick buckets at the other end against the worst transition defense that anyone will see in this postseason. So I think that's the main concern for Minnesota if they're going to roll with the strategy of stopping Jokic from slicing them up as a playmaker that we've seen them deploy before, but they will need something to at least weave into their coverages to bother Jokic, the scorer, as well. And I actually think we're going to see them throw sporadic double teams at Jokic and do it pretty effectively. I think it's against conventional wisdom to double Jokic. He's one of the best playmakers in the history of the league. But when the Wolves have sent that second defender at him to force the ball out of his hands, and then had multiple players scrambling in rotation out of it, I think this can actually work as a legitimate curveball for Denver's offense to have to deal with. Not because Jokic isn't going to pick out the right guy, he almost always will, but because it simplifies their defense. The double comes, Jokic makes the right pass, and the low man rotation is the obvious next step for the defense. And that forces Denver's role players to make plays as passers and rim finishers and even shooters that they're not always relied on to make. Less split actions, less multiple off-ball screening actions, less time for Jokic to manipulate the defense. It almost allows Minnesota to be the ones who dictate the pass that Jokic is going to make, even if it's the correct one, and then they can defend it on their terms. This is a good example again. He catches, the double comes right away, and now Minnesota knows this rotation is their next one to make, and that the next defender needs to slide over and help the helper at the rim. That defense takes a lot of connectivity, but it does simplify those rotations for Minnesota, and I think they're really good at it when they're locked in. Now this can't and won't be Minnesota's base defensive coverage, but I don't think doubling Jokic pretty frequently should be taboo in this series like it's often treated as. I think it forces tough shots and forces turnovers if executed properly, and most importantly, it allows Minnesota to race Denver down the court off those misses and turnovers so that they can generate easy offense as well. I want to see Minnesota selling out on these doubles, forcing Jokic to play in crowds, and then using any positive result they can get from that to torch Denver's slow and bad transition defense. They just have to find some risks to take to muddle Denver's insane offensive efficiency, and I think this is the right one. This isn't something Minnesota has been afraid to do either. Especially throughout this season with this version of their team. They've sent doubles over 25 times in their 4 games by my count, and their success rate has been super high in both getting stops and turning them into points at the other end. If they can hold up in their base coverage and then throw these ambush doubles at him with the backside rotator being there on time and on point, maybe they can have multiple looks that they can actually give Denver a tough time with. And because Jokic is a human supercomputer, there's going to be times where this scheme, like all schemes, looks silly when Jokic rips it apart. If the double is a little lax, or the help rotations are a little late, it's going to lead to some easy buckets, but I think that's just part of the risk-reward game Minnesota is going to have to play in a bunch of different ways in this series. If they win these gambles enough, if they turn them into points at the other end, if they manage to stifle Denver's movement and screening and that puppet master controlling it all, the Wolves might just have a shot at upsetting the Nuggets and getting out of the first round. If you liked this video and want to see more like it coming up during the playoffs, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and give me your takes on this series in the comments below. Thanks again for watching.